Hello, welcome back to Introduction to Linguistics, Linguistics 201. And this is our week 14, our 13th lecture in the lecture series, and also our last one. So thank you for joining me. The readings for today, there weren't any. There are textbook chapters that cover many of the topics we'll talk about today, but as this is the last week of the course, I'd rather you focus on any assignments you may be working on. I do have some announcements for this week, however, because it is the last week of this course, there are lots of things happening. On Thursday, we'll be having our normal Thursday meeting. However, instead of having a practice and discussion period, we'll be having a workshop to work on your assignment 3. So be sure to have the excerpt ready that you'll be analyzing. Also on Thursday, the extra credit article evaluation number 2, the second deadline for this term, will be due. It's due through the D2L Dropbox, which has a deadline of 5 o'clock p.m. Mountain Time. There's further information available on D2L about this. And then on Friday, assignment 2 will be due. This is due at 11:59 p.m. Through the D2L Dropbox. So if you have any questions about that, be sure to ask them and then get that submitted by Friday evening. Before we start on today's lecture, however, I'd like to acknowledge that we're here learning in the area where the Bow and Elbow Rivers meet in southern Alberta, a place known in Blackfoot as Mohkinstsis, which is a name now used to refer to the entire city of Calgary. This land lies within the territory of Treaty 7, which was signed by this land's stewards, who were representatives of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda. Additionally, this land is home to speakers of Cree and Tunaha, as well as members of the Métis Nation of Alberta. I am a newcomer to this land. I come from Blanchet, the land of many tongues at the mouth of the Mississippi, the Great River. I strive to learn more about the land, its peoples, their languages, and their history every day. Here at the University of Calgary, I hope to contribute to and continue a journey of transformation and renewal in our ways of knowing, doing, connecting, and being, all with the spirit of truth and reconciliation for continued shared enjoyment of this beautiful place. So the plan for today is simply a survey of the various fields and subfields of linguistics and applied linguistics that will inevitably analyze or combine the various parts that we've already analyzed in this course into more directed and focused subfields. So the ones we'll be talking about today are sociolinguistics, historical linguistics, language acquisition, psycholinguistics, language and marketing, and then we'll end off with computational linguistics. So the first of these subfields of applied linguistics is sociolinguistics. So as I've hinted at throughout the semester, especially early on, languages vary. In fact, they vary way more than a single textbook or a single data set or a single exercise can represent that a language varies. Once you put that in writing, you're kind of focusing one variety over another. So it's in an intro course, it's somewhat difficult to actually encapsulate all of the variation that may occur, that can occur when studying a language. Indeed, I hesitate even saying a language because every languages vary, and there's so many variants within a language that it's better to just talk about varieties of language, or you might call them dialects or accents even. All of these are variants of language that depend on various features. And they all have variances within their phonetics, their phonologies, their morphologies, their syntax, their semantics, and even their pragmatics. Languages vary. They're always changing and always varying from each other. Sometimes this variation can be regional, in which case you have regional dialects, and you'll have something called dialectology, the study of dialects. But other times, and more often, it may involve social factors. These can be things like gender, social class or socioeconomic status, age, race, and nationality. Heck, that doesn't even cover all the potential social factors that can and do show up as affecting variation of language. I'm sure you could think of more to add to this list. And I welcome your additions in the comments or in discussion. But with sociolinguistics, this is particularly the study of how language varies with respect to social factors and how language can reflect variation within society as well. And so I feel, and many linguists feel, that this arm, this branch, this way of studying linguistics is going to be an ever-growing and ever-important application of linguistic study. So much so that there's even a chapter in the book, much later in the book than we've been covering, but it is indeed in the chapter, and there are indeed textbooks that do talk about sociolinguistics in general and sociolinguistics of particular languages. But if you are interested in sociolinguistics, chapter 15 in contemporary linguistic analysis will cover that, or attempt to cover or introduce you to that, however so briefly. Additionally, here at the University of Calgary, we have a specific course, which is the Introduction to Sociolinguistics, LING 373. So if you're interested in that, you can look out for that the next time we offer it here at the university. And I implore you to take it. The next subfield I'd like to talk about is historical linguistics. So in addition to languages varying in a single time period based on various social factors, language can also vary and change over time, and that's another thing. That variation in the present leads to change in the future, and so we can apply that to the past, and so variation in the past led to the changes that we can observe now, the variants we can observe now, and how languages have changed from the past to the present and will continue to change in the future. And so this field of historical linguistics studies how languages that are related to each other have diverged from each other and how we can reconstruct single proto or common languages from a set of related languages. And indeed, I've hinted at this throughout the course, is that English and most European languages derive from a language which we call Proto-Indo-European, which also is the ancestor language of many South Asian languages, which is where we get that Indo prefix in Indo-European. So this language was spoken 3,000 to 4,000 years ago, and we have various ways of telling that, including intersections with archaeology, just cultural analysis, anthropology, and many other ways to determine when a common or proto-language was last spoken. And one of the primary ways we can reconstruct these proto-languages is through contrastive analysis, or comparative analysis rather. And so if you were to take a course in historical linguistics, you might start with this and with the rule or the guiding principle that sound change is going to almost always be systematic. And so if you take a set of words in a set of related languages that you think are related, you can compare them in order to reconstruct the proto-sounds that make up that proto-word in the proto-language. And so we can do this if we compare words from English, Latin, Greek, and Sanskrit, four languages that are spoken all across the world. But if we look at these words, we have English father, Latin pater, Greek pater, and Sanskrit Peter. You can see there's similarities across those. The last three all have a P and a T and an R, whereas the English has an F and a th and an R. If we extend this set to other words, we have mother in English, mater in Latin, meter in Greek, and mater in Sanskrit. And so we can start, as you build these correspondence sets, as we call them, you can get more and more information and more specific and more confident with the reconstructed proto-language. And just to give you more, we have three, tres, tri, and tri. So here, we see that case where there was T in the other three languages. We have TH in English. And just to go down our numbers, we have two, duo in Latin, di in Greek and va in Sanskrit. So here where we have D in the other three languages, we have T in English. So we can start to draw relationships between what we have in English we might expect in the other languages, or vice versa. So when we have these Ds, we have Ts in English. We have Ts, we have THs in English. And when we have Ps, we have Fs in English, with pater and father. So the study of historical linguistics doesn't have to be over centuries, as one language evolves into the other. It could be studied over smaller decades or even years. You could study just based on a set of data you have from a particular time. You can compare it to a set of data you had at a different time, and you could see how language has changed over that time. And so if you're interested in this subfield of linguistics, you can read Chapter 8 in Contemporary Linguistic Analysis. Additionally, we have a series of courses in historical linguistics taught at the University of Calgary. These are LING 353, LING 453, and LING 553. So next, I want to talk about language acquisition. This is the subfield that I'm most interested in. It's writing on my research is in, what I'm writing my thesis within. And so, this is one way to learn about the language system and the languages is to look at how people are learning those languages. When they pick up a new language, or they're picking up a language for the first time, studying what they're doing, how they're behaving, what they're saying, what they're signing. This can tell us a lot about how they think and how they perceive of language. So traditionally, language acquisition is broken up into two separate fields because of the different hypotheses we have about what happens when each case happens. So the first of these is first language acquisition, FLA or L1A, in which what we're studying is how children learn their first language. So this is mainly infants, toddlers, and children learning the language that their caretakers are teaching them. Whether or not they're intentionally teaching, they'll just pick it up. And that's something fascinating about first language acquisition, is that it's almost completely natural and innate to the process of growing up. So a very applied field of first language acquisition is the field of speech-language pathology, in which we can diagnose, treat speech and communication disorders in children and even older humans, adults, when we come across those speech and communication disorders. So we can study what the natural or the normal, quote unquote, rate of and path of development for someone is, and we could see how, if someone's deviating from that, and how we can help to address that. And the other subfield of language acquisition, the traditional subfield, is second language acquisition, SLA or L2A. And this is the study of mainly adults, but primarily the main focus is just how anyone's learning a second language, of which is in the name. And so this typically accompanies very applied fields of classroom research. So we go into the language classroom where people are teaching and learning language and seeing what works, what doesn't work, what's effective, what's less effective, in getting these people to pick up and use a language which is different than the language they grew up with. But even within that we haven't really captured all of the possibilities with language acquisition. And so in the past 20 or so years, we've started to develop a new subfield within language acquisition called third language acquisition. So we're just adding a number each time. And so we have TLA, L3A this time. And this is how people who have already acquired one language already acquired two languages. In other words, they're already multilinguals and they're learning an additional language. And as things stand now, this is probably going to be more applicable to most cases of acquisition among multilinguals, regardless of whether this is actually their third language. It could be their fourth or fifth, because the idea is you already have a native first language and you already have something that's not your first language, and so the principles should apply just with more complexities when you add more and more languages. And because it's so complex, there's several chapters in which our textbook discusses language acquisition. So chapters 10 through 13 will discuss these various fields of first language acquisition, second language acquisition, multilingualism, bilingualism, and various levels of detail. So if you're interested in that, you can definitely check that out or reach out to me. And indeed, we also have a series of courses which cover the field of language acquisition. So these are LING 316, 416, and 516 here at the University of Calgary. Additionally, if you're interested specifically in speech-language pathology, we have LING 337, which is the Intro to Speech-Language Pathology, which is going to be necessary if you want to apply to a master's program in speech-language pathology in order to treat speech and communication disorders. And so this field of language acquisition is heavily interacts with our next field, which is psycholinguistics. Because in order to learn a language, you have to process it. Anything you do with language, you have to process it. And so this is what the field of psycholinguistics has to do, how language is processed in the mind. And we could study this by examining particularly the subconscious effects of language use. Rather than asking people how they use their language, we observe how they use their language, whether or not they're actually aware of what they're doing. And so we can study these effects by examining the slips of the tongue, which are kind of what you might call speech errors, in which you kind of swap sounds or swap words or use one word when you meant another. All of these can tell us different ways in which our mind is handling all of that linguistic information that is necessary to use language. You could also look at the particular words that people are using. Whenever we're using a word in a sentence, you might have multiple words that you could choose from, and your specific choice might tell us something about what you've experienced in language before, what you're thinking about besides actually your use of language, and all sorts of things, just all sorts of things about the context in which that language use is occurring. Speaking of which, you have priming, in which and this is what I was talking about with the previous experience, when that drives a particular choice, quote unquote, subconscious choice, to use a particular word form based on that previous experience. That's what we call priming, which occurs generally in psychological studies as well. So it's not just a psycholinguistic priming effect, it's a psychological priming effect. You could also study based on the reaction times. So you play a bit of language and you can measure the reaction time, and that will tell us something about how you're perceiving the language that you heard or saw or read. Instead of measuring things temporally, you can measure things spatially by measuring the eye movements and see what your eye is tracking as you're perceiving the language, in order to tell us what's visually important or less important when you are using or perceiving language. And even beyond this, you could start to measure brain activity in something called neurolinguistics, in which you're studying neurological activity rather than psychological activity. And so you could put electrodes on the brain and measure various effects of that brain activity based on different stimuli that are linguistic, and that's neurolinguistics. And so you could examine all of these things, well, most of these things naturally, or you could study them experimentally. And so most of the time when you're looking at an experimental study of linguistics, it would probably fall within the field of psycholinguistics, or psychology has informed how we can construct those linguistic experiments. And so psycholinguistics has been a very important part of developing experimental studies in linguistics. And so this informs the various fields of linguistics that we have covered in this course, such as phonetics, phonology, morphology, syntax, semantics, and pragmatics, and all of the ways they can interact. So it is a bit complicated, and that's why there's 2 chapters in contemporary linguistic analysis, chapters 13 and 14. which you can refer to if you're interested in this. Additionally, we have a course in psycholinguistics, which is cross-coded with psychology. So it's LING 467 or Psych 467 here at the University of Calgary. So if you're interested in psycholinguistics or want to learn more about it, you can look up the information for that course and when it's next going to be offered. And this, so psycholinguistics, as I said, interacts with so much. It also interacts with, again, a very applied field, and this is language and marketing, or also called language and advertising it. And so based on all of our compiled linguistic analyses and observations, we can develop ways to best utilize language in the economic system we all live in, or most of us live in, and that's capitalism. So how to use language in capitalism. And so specifically what language and marketing is looking at is what works best in persuading potential customers, or what works best in foregrounding the good features of your product while backgrounding any of the bad features. So I talked a bit about this during our morphology section, where we talked about different innovations of language and of morphology in order to help sell or emphasize a product. You could really do that with all sorts of different parts of language in order to best emphasize or sell your product. And indeed, we can do this in how to name the brand or product, and how to best emphasize that in the advertisements. And so we have a course in language and advertising here at the University of Calgary, and this is LING 223. And finally, I'd like to end with a ever-growing and ever important field of linguistic study, and that's computational linguistics. So, of course, just like we live in capitalism, we currently live in a very computational age. The past 40, 50, 60 years, we've developed a lot in the technology of computation and computers. And so you might have wondered, and indeed some of you have wondered, how can we make computers do language like humans? As I mentioned throughout the course, we can think of language like and the brain as a computer or a program on a computer. So that means we must have a way to make programs and computers act like the brain that's in our heads. But that's a bit easier said than done. So you might have some of these questions, or indeed other questions, in which how do we process language, or can computers process language like humans? How do we produce language, which may be in fact be different than how we process and perceive language? And can we make a computer produce language like humans? Beyond the processing and production of language, we also need computers to be able to adapt their language use to context, because that's something humans can do, adapt the context and the interpretation of some things based on that context. So can we make computers adapt their language use to fit the context of that language use? That's very important in order to make computers do language like humans. And then there's also the case of translation. Of course, there's thousands upon thousands of language varieties that we need to be able to translate between, and usually that's traditionally been done with human translators, but we have computational tools which are modeling after the human brain, so why shouldn't these computers be able to act as our translators instead of having to have a human act as our translator? There are obviously anytime you bring up artificial intelligence and computational things, there is the case of ethics. And so that's another thing we'll have to think about in asking and answering all of these questions as well. Currently, there aren't any courses in computational linguistics at the University of Calgary, but it is very much a field that is being studied, and there are computational linguistics programs across the world that are asking these questions and specific points within these questions. And because it is such an up-and-coming field, I do think that most universities will begin to offer these if they aren't already, including here at the University of Calgary. But these just cover just a few of the things that I find most fascinating about what we can do with our sum of linguistic knowledge that we've been compiled over the hundreds of years that we've been studying, even thousands of years that we've been studying language and language use. And so I'm very interested in see what y'all have been thinking about as this course is played out. What other applications of linguistics have you been wondering about, or do you know for a fact we can use our linguistic knowledge to apply that linguistic knowledge towards? So please, I ask you to share them in the comments or in class discussion, or even just directly with me, because I am very interested in what y'all find interesting in language and applied linguistics and applied linguistics. So that's something I want to leave with you, is that I'm always willing and ready to discuss linguistics, so please don't hesitate to reach out. But that's all I have for you today, and indeed all I have for you for this course. So I'll leave you with these announcements for the University of Calgary course, but I do want to say, as I said on the last slide, don't hesitate to reach out. Leave your thoughts, comments, and likes. So don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe if you're watching on YouTube. And it's been a pleasure to present this course over YouTube and in person at the University of Calgary. And I hope you've learned, even as I've learned. I know I've learned, so I hope that you've learned throughout the duration of this course. And I hope you continue to learn and think about these concepts that we've covered in the past few months. So once again, thank you. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And have a wonderful time doing whatever you find interesting. Because what I find interesting is linguistics, and that's why I do linguistics every day. And I hope if you don't find linguistics interesting, you find what's interesting to you. So thanks, and so long.